Thank you so much, Rabbi Isai, for the opportunity to share Divrei Torah with you and be mischazik together with you. It's hard and difficult to imagine a more appropriate time to discuss Ibn Torah's Hashkafa in the engagement in Yigia Kapayim and Pasha Shkolim. The Chidushi Harim, as brought in Siach Sarkei Kodesh, explains that the sequence of the Daled Parshias are a build-up towards Chodesh Nisan, and as such, each parsha specifically relates to a specific stage of hachana as we prepare for the hischadshus of Klal Yisrael in Chodesh Nisan. And if we begin with Parsha Shkolim, that means we're beginning with Inyanim, says the Chidush Harim, which address the moment of someone. In which case we see that in the sequence of Avodah, engaging in Aliyah in the areas of moment is foundational. And so the Chidush Harim says Parsha Shkolim is the Kedusha of the moment of Klal Yisrael. Parsha Zohar deals with the Biur Hara, Biur Amalek. Para allows us to then proceed to an additional madrega of Tara. Parsha Chodesh represents the ultimate goal, which is renewal, Chidush. And so when we begin the process of Aliyah, we begin with first the process of being Mekadesh, everything that makes up our material context. Then we begin with internal Biur Hara, we proceed to Taira, and then proceed to Chidush. Parsha Shkolim represents the ability of Mammon to represent Kofer Nefesh. That's the way the Torah describes what the Nesina of a shekel is. L'chaper al nafshei seichem. By merely going through the act of giving a machzah shekel to the Rebbeinu Shalom, we somehow accomplish something called a Kofer Nefesh. It's difficult to understand. A half shekel wasn't a large amount of money. How is it that by being able to give away a machzah shekel, we accomplish something as special and as foundational as Kofer Nefesh? The Baal HaTanya, in the beginning of the Sefer, makes the following observation. He says, if one looks through Yerushalmi, then whenever the Yerushalmi refers to just mitzvah, just the word mitzvah, the Yerushalmi is referring to the mitzvah of tzedakah. Now, our discussion is not about the significance of tzedakah or about the significance of being able to part with one's moment, but more using the significance of the mitzvah of tzedakah to explain what our relationship to our Yigia Kapayim is. So the Baal HaTanya offers us the following insight why it is that Stam Mitzvah is tzedakah. And he says, because when we engage in the pursuit of generating wealth, he says that activity draws within it every aspect of ourselves. Our intelligence, our drive, our ambition, our physical energy. When a person has a goal, when a person sets themselves an ambition, an agenda, a drive, that incorporates every aspect of self, from one's seichel down to one's most basic energy, one's basic koyach. He says, therefore, when we generate wealth, we're zeicha to generate as a result of bracha being granted to us, then that we've earned and that what we've generated, we see as an extension of ourselves. And it is an extension of ourselves. It represents drive, it represents ambition, it represents intelligence, it represents strength, it represents energy, it represents all that is incorporated within ourselves. Memela says the Baal HaTanya, the importance of tzedakah, that it's called Stam Mitzvah, is because even though ordinarily a mitzvah is associated with a particular part of a person, Whether it's achilas matzah, which refers to the pear, netilas lulav, which refers to the yodayim, each mitzvah is mekadesh a specific aver in the guf. The Baal HaTanya says that our pursuit of earning, which is then reflected in our ability to then forgo that for a higher purpose, is really incorporates a totality of ourselves and is the ability to give away self. And he says, as opposed to any other mitzvah, which relates and is mekadesh a specific part of the person, tzedakah is mekadesh in a person's entire being. Now again, our discussion is not focused so much on the tzedakah part, but we then understand that our pursuit of accomplishing materially is something which is an all-encompassing occupation. And therefore, not just can we elevate that and forego it through tzedakah, but we then realize that if our approach to the engagement in Yegiya Kapayim is with that sense that this is occupying ourselves and every part of us, and we can infuse that with Ritzonah Yisbarach, then we've been mekadesh every part of ourselves. That's the reason why giving away a machzah shekel can be a kofar nefesh. Because however, it's not the amount which is significant. The ability for a person to forego what represents the expression of ambition, drive, intelligence, energy, motivation, and to give that away is the person foregoing something which represents nefesh. And therefore, the nesina of machzah shekel, says the Chidush Arim, is the first step in avodas Hashem, because in the parasha of machzah shekel, it includes the ability to gain a kedusha perspective on an activity which engages every part of ourselves. The Rashba in a tshuva discusses why we don't make a bracha on machzah shekel. And he says the reason why we don't make a bracha is because when we give the shekel, he says, it's because miyodcha nosanu loch. We're returning back to the Rebbeinu Shalom, what is ultimately and originates with the Rebbeinu Shalom Kiviyachal himself. Which means that when we are able to forgo our moment, we look at that as just another aspect of the Kedusha and the Ratzon Hashem, which envelops and engages and defines everything that we do in the pursuit of earning. And if it's a Ratzon of the Rebbeinu that should we give it away, that's another aspect of that same process of engaging in the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Rabbi Chana Wasserman, in a letter that is printed in the back of Kavitz Ha'aretz, discusses the basic question of how we find the balance between limud HaTorah and engaging in parnasa. And he says that ordinarily we understand that the way in which we approach that question is by looking at engaging in parnasa as something that we're compelled to do in order to be able to sustain ourselves. And therefore we take the approach that we forego as much Torah learning as we can because we're compelled to engage in something which is a necessity. So that's ordinarily the way we conceive of it. And Rabbi Chanan explains that this is a mistake. He says, in the same way as any mitzvah which we have a chiyuv to engage in forgoes Talmud Torah, we take time from Limud HaTorah to daven, we take time from Limud HaTorah to do any of the mitzvahs of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Parnasa is another of the mitzvahs which the Rebbeinu Shalom has charged us to do. The mitzvah of V'asafta degonecha, the Gemara in the beginning of Ketzad Mevarchim that we're familiar with. That, says Rabbi Chanan, is a mitzvah the same as any other mitzvah b'Torah. And the same way as any other mitzvah b'Torah forgoes limud HaTorah, so too the mitzvah being Eising in Parnasa is a mitzvah. So when discussing what our approach is towards Eisek HaParnasa, we understand that we're doing no less than being Mekayim another one of the mitzvahs HaTorah. And this is not just a theoretical discussion in terms of how we balance technically limud HaTorah and engaging in parnasa. It should create a shift in mindset. many of us engage in business or whatever activity we're engaged in through which we are Isaac in Parnasa, with the understanding that, in the same way as there's an expression that everything is fair in love and war, so everything sort of becomes fair in the world of business, because the world of business is by definition profane. The world of business by definition is something which we're compelled to engage in as something which we're almost an onus, as Rabbi Chanan puts it, to be involved with. And somehow the Rebbeinu Shalom and the world of business sort of make an uneasy accommodation with each other. But fundamentally, when we leave our homes, we leave the Beis Medrash, we leave wherever we are, and we enter into the business world, we're entering into a godless world. Because what is Kedusha and Ruchnius is in the Beis Medrash, and everything else was somehow an onus to engage in, because the Rebbeinu Shalom created a world in which we have to sustain ourselves. And that's a lost opportunity to in fact see that the Beis Medrash and the outside world are completely seamless. There's a volume of Shulchan Aruch which deals with the world outside the Beis Medrash, and there's a volume of Shulchan Aruch which deals with the world inside of the Beis Medrash, and there's no difference between the two. The sense that somehow we're compelled to engage in something which is subpar in Ruchnius, it's somehow bidi eved, a necessity, something which we're compelled to do, leads us to a place where we kind of feel that anyway we're sort of out of the realm of Ruchnius, and therefore everything is fair. And we so often hear, unfortunately, the expression of, well, it's business after all, which somehow makes business a sort of a godless sphere of activity, chas v'shalom. Because, well, we can't make that consistent with the Beis Medrash, and we have understood we're somehow engaging something in which we're compelled to act. So we kind of create a split in our minds, and we disassociate our ruchniistic selves, our growing selves, our halachic selves from everything that exists within the realm of business, in which case then everything becomes fair. And it's not just so incorrect, and it's not just so wrong, but it's a lost opportunity that something which we have to engage in, we can infuse with the significance of mitzvah, with the significance of the fulfillment of the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom, as a process of aliyah, and unwittingly we can find ourselves being depriving ourselves of that opportunity. Even from a narrow halachic perspective, it's told about Rabbi Yisrael Salanta that Rabbi Yisrael Salanta encouraged someone to take on the position of a town sheikhet, which in those days was not just a position which had a significant remuneration, but it was also a position of a lot of responsibility and a lot of ruchniistic significance, as is evidenced by a multitude of tshuvas that were about how to assign and how to take away, perhaps, the position of town sheikhet. And the young man who Rabbi Yisrael was talking to said, he's afraid of the responsibility of perhaps making a mistake in the shechita or releasing a treifa and so on. So Rabbi Yisrael then asked him, so what career do you want to engage in? And he said, I think I'll go into the world of business. So Rabbi Yisrael said, there are more simonim in Shulchan Aruch that govern how to do business in a halachically sound way than govern the halachas of shechita. You're exchanging a relatively straightforward realm of activity for one that is far, far more complex, even from a halachic standpoint. Imagine. And therefore, the first point of chizuk which I felt I would want to share and with the tzibur is that this tzibur of Bnei Aliyah is to see that the world of business activity and the Beis Medrash are seamless. If we find ourselves living in two different ways, then we haven't fully bridged the way of actualizing the Ratzon Hashem in our business endeavors. If our sense of self changes when we move from one activity to the other, then we haven't created within ourselves that holistic sense of this is all Avodas Hashem. the Chachmas Adam, the famed Chachmas Adam, the author of the Chachmas Adam and the Chaya Adam, he writes in his introduction to Chachmas Adam that by trade, despite being one of the Dayanim in Vilna, his parnasa came from being a merchant. And he describes how he would travel to the fair in Danzig and come back. And he said what enabled him to make those two worlds consistent and be able to write his Sfarim and continue to engage in learning despite the disparity between the two. The distance between Leipzig and Vilna wasn't just kilometers on a train track, it was worlds. And he said the reason is because I saw no difference between the two. As I was engaged in business, my mind was on my learning, and when I was engaged in learning, my mind was at the Rebbeinu Shem Sisha and Bracha in my business, and it was a seamless whole. And he said, therefore, I didn't see it as being a dramatic and radical departure from the Beis Medrash when I went to engage in business, and vice versa, because it was part of a seamless whole. And that allows us to see the two as consistent and to bring Kedusha from one into the other without seeing the two as being fundamentally different. And this is important in terms of the pride that we should feel in ourselves, in that this is the way in which the Rebbeinu Shalom is sending us bracha. No less than the Nefesh HaChaim that taught us the centrality and how sublime and how elevated Limud HaTorah is, both to the person themselves and to the universe as a whole, writes very clearly in Shar Aleph that to engage in Vasafta de Gonecha is the rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom for the Klal Yisrael. It's not a concession, it's not a b'diavad. He says we paskin like Rabbi Shmuel, that we are mitzuvah to be oisik in parnasa, and that is the ultimate rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom for Klal Yisrael. And we should be able to look at ourselves that way and see that when we are engaged in the activity of parnasa, we are engaged in the rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Shla HaKadosh brings in Maseches Chulin and Shla that there's a l'shem yichud that a person can say before departing to work. A l'shem yichud. Not all of us might have the minhag to say l'shem yichud, but we know l'shem yichud from the siddur that's before talis and before tefillin and before we start Baruch Sha'amar. L'shem yichud, we're making yichudim in Olam Yisrael Yonim. We're fulfilling the deepest rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom for the Bria. L'shem yichud kutchabrichu u'shchinte hinni hoylech lasik b'masa u'matam. There's a medrash that's quoted that Chanoich toifer min olim haya. Chanoich so choose. He was a shoemaker. Val kol tfira v'tfira haya meyachet yichudim. Means when we're engaged in the mundane, we're being oisik in tikkun abriya. This is not random. It's not a concession. It's not something that's just a necessary evil. It's Ritzaynei Yisbarach. The Chovos HaLevavos in Sha'ar B'tachon speaks about how we choose a career. And he says that the choice of a career of a person is for a person to introspect in themselves, look at their strengths and weaknesses, and see that if the Rebbeinu Shalom created me with a certain cluster of talents, that means the rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom was that it should be oisik and kach v'kach. And that's how you fulfill bitachon and ishtadlus in terms of choosing a career, just as an example. Which means that what the Chovos HaLevavos essentially is teaching us is the way that the Rebbeinu Shalom has prepared us in the talents, the insight, the ability that He's given us to be able to fulfill that role. When we mispal atachoin and la'adam das, we don't just mean to be able to understand the sugya that we're learning. We're just as much asking for the Rebbeinu Shalom to give us insight in terms of the strategic decisions that we make. And that's all part of the das that the Rebbeinu Shalom gives us. Rebbe Apian would often say, when you would stand in London next to a subway station, and you would see streams of people commuting to work, he would say the difference between it just being a mundane activity and being kedusha just lies in the kavanah. Just shifting the mindset that we're being oisik in avodas Hashem in every part of it transforms it from business to avodah. It's such an opportunity. It's an opportunity to grasp in terms of our own sense of self. And that pride, as the Nefesh HaChaim says, in fulfilling the rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom for Klal Yisrael, should instill in us the pride to give that over to our children. Personally, I come from a background where my parents were from a Yakasha Kehillah. There was a pride in being an upstanding, honest, Noisev and Noisen Be'emunah. People were admired for integrity. It was a ruchniistic calling. It was a ruchniistic standing. The title Hachover, which was given out to a respected and senior balabayas, was very often given to someone who had a reputation for outstanding integrity in business. It was something as children we grew up admiring and aspiring to. The idea that someone was impeccably honest. Someone whose masa u'maton was be'emunah in all the way that the Torah requires it to be be'emunah. That's a pride. If we can create a seamless transfer between our homes, between the Beis Medrash, between business, and that's mekadesh everything that we do, then it's part of avodah. And it's a pride with which our children will carry, and our children will see that we have. It's something magnificent to be someone who has a reputation of what's called in Chazal a shem tov. It's something that's priceless and something which we can all aspire to. And this idea of going for mitzvah, and that all our masul matan is mitzvah, gives us something also which we yearn for, and that is something called shomer mitzvah lo yeda davar ra. As we leave the Beis Medrash and engage in the world of masul matan, it's a world of nisayon. Not just a world of nisayon in terms of kedusha, not just in terms of integrity. The Chovos HaLevavos says one of the reasons why the Rebbeinu Shem created the Bria, and which his rotzen is that we should engage in Parnasa, is because, as the Chovos HaLevavos says, that gives us the greatest test in life, where we can keep consistent in our own minds a world which seemingly rewards just effort and rewards guile and rewards intelligence, and the idea that everything is the rotzen of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Says that's one of the greatest nisayonos that face, and that's the purpose of the Rebbeinu Shem creating a world which requires masul matan. We want to retain that purity, we want to retain that integrity, we want to retain that kedusha, we want to attain that focus. Shomer mitzvah lo yeda davar ra. We have a number of sugyas in which someone engaged in mitzvah is zoiche to a shmira elyoina, which isn't the same if a person is being oisik in divrei chayil. By elevating our masul matan to the status of mitzvah, we've merited a shmir el yona. And it's not just a shmir el yona for us; it's a shmir el yona it's a shmir el yona from all those that may have designs on what we're doing. The world in which we trade, the world in which we do business, can be ruthless. And there's only a limit to how much we can outsmart the competition, how much we can outsmart those whose practices are not with the same degree of integrity as ours. We need shmira. Shomer mitzvah leyeda davar. Gam ki elech begeit salmoves le'irura ki ata imodi. I walk with the Hashkafa of the Rebbeinu Shalom. My path is paved by the Rebbeinu Shalom's hanhaga and Hashkafa. We can be zeicha to that by inspiring ourselves and living that our engagement in Eisek HaParnasa is mitzvah. Shomer mitzvah leyeda davar ra. We elevate the entire way in which the Rebbeinu Shalom is mashgiach and manig what we do. It also, and with this point we'll conclude, it also elevates our tefillah. We often struggle with the ability to be mispala. Firstly, because the rarefied and elevated world which tefillah takes us to often seems so incongruous with the world which we occupy. And secondly, I think if we introspect, we often feel, Rabbeinu Shalom, how can I daven for these things? Ultimately, we feel inadequate and we feel, should I be davening for this? Is this something which can be included with the nusach of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? It's kedai to share an avodrom that the Beis brings. Tfilas HaMincha has the greatest Eis Rotzen of all the tfilas of the day. We just had in last week's Haftarah, Vayhi Ba'alois HaMincha. That's when Eliyahu Hanavi's tfilas were answered, which created the momentous Yisroirus in Klal Yisrael of Hashem Hu Elokim, and the vanquish of the Sheker of the Nevi'ei Haba. Vayhi Ba'alois HaMincha. The Avodrom says that the reason why Mincha is an Eis Rotzen is because if a person is able to step away from the rush of his activity at the height of the middle of the day and be able to reconnect with the Rebbeinu Shalom, that generates the greatest Eis Rotzen possible. Now, how does one do that? How does one step out and then step into Tefillah? The answer is because there's no contradiction at all. It's two forms of Avodas Hashem. The Chovos HaLevavos just says we live the Nisayon of recognizing that all that we're oisik in is matan is just a reflection of Etzoni's bar. If we then are able to come into Tefillah Samincha, then Adarabbo, Tefillah and what we're oisik in are one whole. When we're mispal for Hatzlacha in business, it's not as though we're stepping out and asking the Rebbeinu Shalom for something sort of second rate. We're asking that the Rebbeinu Shalom should allow Hatzlacha to come b'masi Aldeinu as a reflection of his Hashgacha, as a reflection of his Chesed, as a reflection of his Hatava. Then tefillah is then consistent with everything we do. To summarize the chizuk, which I felt I wanted to share, that we can be inspired together with, is to recognize how much kedusha, how much mitzvah, and how much rotzen Hashem lies in what we do. And rather at looking at how to try and make consistent two things which somehow lu'umas the Beis Medrash, the boardroom is somehow something else. That isn't combined with malacha, that isn't merged with malacha, won't last and will be geira avay. The Torah will be geira avay. Says the Sasemes, and the Sasemes' Vaad is the summary of, I think, what we've discussed together tonight. The Sasemes says that if a person remains, we'll use a modern term, remains split between his Torah side and his mundane side, then not just hasn't he successfully merged his mundane side with his Kedusha, but his Torah can actually lead him astray because it's not integrated. And the Torah can be Chas v'Shalom Gereres Avay. Because he thinks that the two somehow have this uneasy coexistence. But in reality, he's completely split between the two. And then, Chas v'Shalom, even the Torah itself can lead the person to error. He says it's only when the two can be combined that Adarabba has a kiyum. Kol Torah she'eni mimlocha seifa b'Torah, because if a person remains schizoid, if he remains somehow completely split between the two, then not just hasn't he been able to be Mekadesh, the mundane part of what he is, but Adarabba, he's undermined the wholesomeness of the Torah which he has. The chizuk is, Rabbi say, they are one and the same. We are Baalei Avodah in Beis Medrash, and we are Baalei Avodah in the boardroom. And all of that is Mekadesh, everything that we do, so that Be'ezer Hashem, not just can we be Zeicha to Shem HaMitzvah L'Yedid Avara, but in the words of the Nefesh HaChaim, we can be Zeicha to the Mekayim of the Rotzen HaYoser of the Rebbeinu Shalom for Klal Yisrael, B'siyata D'Shmaya.
Application that the Rav discussed. How sometimes the workplace could be a godless environment. So here's just a few questions relating to chesed versus work. If a company needs to let a film employee go for reasons like downsizing or for poor performance, what responsibility does an Arab employer have to his employee?
Yeah. So, just to discuss the question in broad terms, obviously every shayla should obviously be asked to a Moira Hira. There are 2 points which you try and make consistent here. On the one hand, we understand that a company is not a chesed or tzedakah organization. A company has to be profitable, and to make profit is certainly what we're there for and is what we're supposed to be Isaac in. However, on the other hand, being able to be mefarnes a person, the Rambam says clearly in Hilchas Matnas Aniyim, is the greatest form of tzedakah that we can give. And the greatest form of chesed that we can give is to allow a person his dignity and allow a person to earn and allow a person to have that sense that he's able to make a living. So certainly a company should realize that the responsibility to a from employee is to try as best as possible to allow it to work within the range of profitability. Now the question that gets very difficult, that often gets very, very complicated, is, for example, the work is being overpaid according to current conditions. In that case, the excess of the salary that the employee is not generating in terms of value of work can be taken off a ma'aser cheshbon. Because, as we said, that's a form of tzedakah, to be able to give the person both the additional income and his dignity to continue earning, and that could be taken from ma'aser. And therefore, the first step would be that if in any way an employee could be retained because their work is valuable, it's not just at the point that the employee is just a liability. In that case, one would try and make the difference up from any possibility, any source of tzedakah that one could have, and even if one has exceeded ma'aser, if one's in a position of still being able to be somewhat generous, then that would be the mitzvah yichashiv. Ultimately, if that's not possible and the company can't, then yes, a company is there to be profitable, and keeping the employee would fit into the person's tzedakah goals. If that wasn't able to be maintained, then the key factor then is maintaining the dignity of the employee. If they have to be sent away, it should be done in the most respectable way, in the way that preserves the dignity of the person, and so on. Because yes, that is an achrayus to a Jewish employee, from employee certainly, in order to preserve the person's dignity as a simple, as ben adam l'chaveri. I would want to add something that that gets frequently asked, and that is, sometimes people say, wouldn't it be just easier for me to employ non-Jewish employees? It's easy come, easy go. There's so many less halachic issues about dismissal. There's so many less halachic issues about ani mahapich b'charora, headhunting and so on. Rabbi said the question is really out of place. Like we began with, it's the greatest form of chesed and mitzvah to offer a from yid a job. And even if that involves challenges, and it is more complex, and there are halachas that are involved in either a kabbalah or a payal, but Rabbi say the schus is immense, the mitzvah is immense, and as was mentioned before, the bracha b'masei yadeinu comes from doing the rotzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And this is something we'll continue probably to this will continue. I imagine we'll continue to repeat in the next few questions. Is that the bottom line isn't everything. And so much of our hatzlach in business is for inexplicable factors that we just don't know and don't understand. All of you probably read, various economic forecasts, analyses, trends, etc., etc. You don't have to do more than compare 3 days ago's prediction to what happened 3 days later to just realize just how vapid and often how inaccurate and just these predictions are. The klal of hakol bidei shamayim applies just as much, and if we omekayim the rotzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom, we'll do well. And adrabah, one is encouraged as much as possible to be able to fill any position that one can, with from employees, despite sometimes the challenges that involves.
There seems to be some loyalty should be due to him as well.
Yes. So there are a number of parts to this question. Again, not coming to get to share piskei halachos, but just to give broad hashkafic and halachic considerations over here. Firstly, there's issues of contract. Just leaving a job for higher pay, does involve a careful reading of a contract, and many parts of the contract, are carry a lot of weight lahalacha. One has to be aware of that. Secondly, in terms of the opportunity to match the offer first, I can't say one's mechuyev to do that la halacha, but certainly it's right in terms of basic decency. Even if we feel that our talents have not been appreciated, salaries should be higher, our boss hasn't given us what we're worth, and so on. There is an employer-employee relationship, and unfortunately, lahavdil, and certainly in the secular world, the idea of loyalty to a company is completely gone. Jobs are much more short-term in the current job market, especially given that skills become outdated so quickly. The job market is more fluid than it's been in many years. The idea of being loyal to a company is something that lahavdil in the common culture is completely gone. One cannot say that la halacha one is mechuyev in that, but there is certainly an aspect of someone who has been a faithful employer, who's given one, especially if he's given a person an opportunity to succeed and climb, of basic hakaras hatoiv, and not just to leave for remuneration alone. And it would be right to have a discussion with the employer, and even if they can't match it dollar for dollar, certainly to consider the offer of the employer. Now, in terms of training and developing the employee, this is a much more nuanced shaila. There is a place in halacha that if an employer has gone through the expense of training and developing an employee, that there is a certain expectation that there should be a return for that training, and each industry has its own span of time in which there's a return for the employer's training. There may also be a minig in the market which applies to that, and that's a shaila which needs a psak in terms of whether or not an employee can just be trained and then develop and then leave. There is another issue which we should touch on, which are non-compete agreements, which both legally and the halacha are a very very complex issue. Depending on how they're worded, there may be some halachic teeth in a non-compete. Other times there may not be, and it's important to also get the guidance of a moira hira in terms of the issues of a non-compete agreement. I would say just to share what just in my small experience as a rov, changing jobs is by definition exchanging one set of problems for another, and the bottom line is not always everything. And as much as a lucrative offer is very, very attractive, we do well to think, what we don't know about the office culture, about what we don't know about whatever else is going on in the other business. Not even from a ruchnis halachic standpoint, but even from a pragmatic standpoint. Not everything in terms of job satisfaction, not everything in terms of career, lies in the bottom line. And an attractive offer is one small part of job satisfaction. I think most people post facto look back at it and say, I'd far rather exchange some job satisfaction and a more positive working environment than the dollar amount. And that's an important consideration when thinking of thinking of a career change.
As a follow-up to that, and maybe as a segue to the next question, does a person have a responsibility to himself, to his family, to try to maximize his amount of earnings? By being a disloyal employee, he, so to speak, could maximize it more than by being a loyal employee.
Right. This is a question that's often discussed, and perhaps we should begin, with the following, which is something that I think is valuable to share, is that ultimately our goal in earning is to provide ourselves a sense of security, a sense of safety, a sense of serenity, what the Chovas HaLevavos calls menuchas hanefesh. One of the things, parenthetically, that the Chovas HaLevavos adds is he says, the idea of I'm going to earn enough money so I have a large enough nest egg that I'll feel secure never happens. It's a Chovas HaLevavos. Every financial advisor's pitch, that if you reach this earning goal, you'll get that sort of much desired feeling of, the Chovas HaLevavos says it doesn't exist. We're always chasing the end of the rainbow. That's just good, perhaps, to share parenthetically. But the point of if you would have to summarize, all of Shara B'tachon, so to speak, in a line, we would say that all that we do is to be able to achieve some degree of what the Chovas HaLevavos calls menuchas hanefesh. Now, every individual has menuchas hanefesh in their own unique way. And the idea of saying that if I can earn more, that by definition will give me greater menuchas hanefesh may not be true. Because the amount of work, the hours, the stress, the uncertainty, that may chip away at the menuchas hanefesh. In which case we've exchanged sort of one dream and lost sight of the goal. So whenever we consider the bitachon and ishtadlus question, but before we even get to sort of what the emunah obligates us, or the mechanics of bitachon obligates us to think about, we want to think about what lahavdil is called a quality of life question. What are we exchanging for what? Yeah. And in terms of being by being a disloyal employee, I can earn more, maybe, but what have I done in the process? What kind of relationships have I broken? What bridges have I burned? How many people have I left hurt? And that all goes into a sense of wholeness and a sense of what we call menuchas hanefesh. And so the bitachon in the shtadlus question is not, does the Rebbeinu Shalom, if I feel a certain amount of potential, expect me to do more? Is there a different lever that I'm supposed to pull? It's a deeply personal process of how I can achieve my personal goal of menuchas hanefesh. And that may be more time with the family. It may be more time in Beis Medrash. Or it may be a certain additional degree of financial security. But the question is ours. The question is, what, if we honestly introspect, what is going to give us a greater amount of menuchas hanefesh? That's really the question, and the approach of how we try and resolve this kind of question.
Along the same vein, several people submitted this question. What's the hashkafa in regards to side hustles? Obviously, it comes at the expense of less time for learning, davening. But I guess ultimately the question is building a robust savings account, a mitzvah, a chayva, or a shos, is that a goal?
Right. So there is and we know that from the halachos of Meiser, there is certainly a certain size of nest egg that a person does build. I'm not sure if that expression is used as much here in the States, but what we call a fund for a rainy day. Right? We understand that, and this is correct planning and correct ishtadlus because that's evidenced in the halachos of Meiser, that a person should build a certain amount of savings. If chas v'shalom a person would ever be incapacitated, or there'd be a catastrophic event, chas v'shalom, or there'd be an unusual medical expense or something like that, that we don't find ourselves in dire financial straits. So yes, there is that first step of a certain amount of savings. In terms of financial stability, that's a very open-ended question. We already mentioned before that achieving that goal will feel I'm fully stable and fully guaranteed, we really never achieve. And Chovos HaLevavos says clearly, and we know that, even after we achieve savings, wherever we put the money, we're always concerned about a downturn in the market, or instability, or other things. The worry does not disappear because we've reached some mythical amount. If a person is under that amount of financial stress, that basic priorities that they've agreed on, that they've determined in their own life are not yet attainable, then yes, then side hustles certainly would be something we'd have to do. A goal like that would be home ownership, things like that, basic staples. But once we're past that, then the Chovos HaLevavos says clearly that the paramount question is how much our ishtadlus is consistent with the Rebbeinu Shalom's avodah. That's what he says. And so something which will cut significantly into learning and davening really has to be questioned. If it's necessary for basics, then yes, that's necessary. But beyond that, the Chovos HaLevavos says either it's not the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom, they should have it, or it will come in a different way. And so something which will cut into learning and davening does have a large question mark over it. Because, like we said before, ultimately, our Asik in Parnasa is for Ritzoni Yisbarach. And our question isn't so much, the language of the question is, a certain amount of financial stability versus work opportunities. It means, what is going to further my goals in Avodas Hashem presently? Staples is what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants us to have basic menuchas hanefesh. But beyond that, it's a very open question. And really needs an honest, and in this case, very often it's helpful to discuss it with a Rebbe or to discuss it with a friend to make sure that our thinking is in line with the priorities of the Chovos HaLevavos.
I want to move on to some halacha-ish questions. What's the guidelines for gift giving to non-Jews? What are the rules or considerations for giving gifts to non-Jews, ranging from tipping to corporate gifting to clients?
Right. So again, there are a lot of details in this question. La halacha. And the basic guideline I think would be helpful to share is that there are certain things which are standard business practice, and there are certain things which are there to cultivate a unique relationship. Standard business practice generally doesn't come into the issur of giving gifts, except if it has a particular association with a holiday and has some religious overtones. But otherwise, tipping, for example, is generally not considered by the poskim in issur of leisachanim. Giving just regular corporate gifts to employees or to business associates or things like that is generally fine. So too, even giving a larger gift, if clearly the motivation is to generate the business relationship, then whether it's a lavish meal or whether it's a sports ticket or whatever it might be that's appropriate for whoever one's trying to engage in a business relationship, generally is okay. It's when it goes more to the realm of personal. You have a long-standing business association with someone, and you want to give it to them where it goes beyond the expected benefit, but it's something more personal. That's already when we get into a serious shaila of gifting. It's also important to bear in mind an issue which is not related to leisachanim, and that is the gifting, the cross-gender gifting, and that's a shaila, which is an issue of standard corporate gifts. If they're given out to the office, or the same kind of gift is given to all clients, that's fine. But once the gift has been chosen, as something that specifically would be something desirable by the opposite gender, right, is something that can be an issue of boundaries in kedusha. Buying a female employee something that a female employee will particularly appreciate, where you've given attention to what the female employee may want, is a serious shaila of kedusha, and vice versa. And that's not a leisachanim issue, but that's related to gidra kedusha, and it's a common shaila.
And another somewhat nuanced halacha question. Currently, lots of work is done on the phone, and there are open emails waiting to be responded to when someone wakes up. What are the guidelines regarding working before Shachris? Does it make a difference if it's Derech Harai or if he has a set minyan that he attends?
Right. So it's worth first beginning with the sort of the gold standard of pre tefillah, and that is that the Kaf HaChaim brings from the Kadmonim that really pre tefillah one should not be engaged in anything mundane at all. That's the gold standard, and it's not just because of the inyanim pnimius that essentially we should really go from sleep to either learning or saying Tehillim or whatever it is, and then go into davening. But even as a practical eitzah, like we had discussed earlier, there's a certain amount of an incongruousness between the world of work and the rarefied world of ruchnius. And getting our mind, into emails, into discussions, is putting us on the fast track to the business part, and is not a good way to be able to enter into that rarefied world of davening. And it's worth sharing that the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that the way we know the makar for the issur of eating before davening is from the pasuk of Leiseichlu al Adam. And the Gemara says Tefillah Shachris is being mispal al dimchem, which means being mispal for our very life. Tefillah Shachris has immense significance. It's a big day ahead, and we want siyata d'shmaya. It's a big day ahead, and we know we need the shmir of the Rebbeinu Shalom. We're pleading for our lives. That's what the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, no less. We want to come to that with focus. So the gold standard is established by the Kaf HaChaim that even just diburim of divrei chayil are best left after davening. Technically, la halacha, there is a serious issue with being oisik in masu matam before tefillah, as is brought in the Paiskim. But the question is, what exactly defines masu matam? So it's very possible that la halacha, responding to an email or just making a brief telephone call and not getting engaged in too much business give and take, may not be considered part of masu matam. But the Gemara then have an additional din that one doesn't begin tefillah with one's mind engaged too much in something else, and that applies even to limud Torah. Incidentally, a person is to be oimed for tefillah mitoch halacha psuka, not mitoch pilpul. So, for example, if you're davening Marav after night Seder, and we were intensely engaged with the Chavrusa learning the Iyun, the halacha is one takes a couple of minutes to be able to focus on tefillah. One is oimen to tefillah mitech halacha psuka, not mitech pilpul. And the same thing is true with matamatan. If our mind is engaged with masu matan, then we haven't prepared ourselves for tefillah. Maybe day traders, but for others besides day traders, I would assume in most cases the email or the call can wait. It can wait the 45 minutes, the 50 minutes, the hour of tefillah shacharis. The beginning, the business can start at 8:30 or 9. We tend to feel anxious. We want to respond. Once we read it, we feel somehow drawn. And the eitzah would be just don't look at the phone until after davening. It really can wait. It's hard to believe that the ishtadlus would be so necessary that we must respond before davening. Best leave the phone and look at it after davening. So to answer the shaila from a halachic perspective, there may be issues of maso matan kodim tefillah. The gold standard is not to be osik in divrei chobot for tefillah, and one has to prepare one's mind b'kavana in order to be able to be mispal with proper focus. And in general, it's a good ruchniistic start for the day, to begin the day where Hashkafa Saboiker is leading to davening. Many have shared with me the transformative power of a seder before davening, even a short seder. To begin davening through Limud HaTorah is a different davening. There's something beautiful about morning kohelim, which have, even if it's a short limud, 15 minutes even, 10 minutes, to begin tefillah mitoich Torah. Right? We're always oimed to be mispal mitoich divrei Torah. That's why we say ashrei before mincha. As Tesis brings from Yushalmi, we're oimed to be mispal mitoich divrei Torah. But the idea of preparing oneself for tefillah in that way is a special opportunity and is really, really encouraged. And is something which really is really very transformative in terms of tefillah and in terms of one's seder hayom, if it's possible.
This is
I've gone all the time. I think we finish at 9. Yeah.
We started a little late.
Okay.
But this will conclude.
No. I just don't want to keep anyone longer than they want to be here.
This is an updated Ainshli Chadvar sort question.
Okay.
With an employee vis-a-vis his employer. A business who's suffering and owes money to vendors, some of them from vendors. And it's the employee's responsibility to try to restructure and squeeze out what he can from some of these vendors. And he's conflicted. It's his job to execute the settlement. What halachic and hashkafic guidance does the employee need prior to being involved in this type of job?
So the company is not able to make payments to its vendors. Right. And the question is what in terms of restructuring what one can do and what one can't. Yeah. This is a very difficult child. And again, not wanting to share piskei halachas because details here are so important. Even if there is a lav of oishek in the Torah, which the Gemara in Bava Metzia describes that even if a person doesn't intend to chas v'shalom default on the payment, but what's called in the Gemara in Bava Metzia leich v'shoiv, right? Which means leich v'shoiv means keep pushing off the person, keep dismissing them. Leich v'shoiv. Pushing them off and come back, is an issue of a lav deraisa. And I'm sure many of you, can share this and certainly know it better than I do. We'd far rather someone who owes us money be upfront, negotiate terms, take responsibility, structure a plan, than to go into avoidance. And very often avoidance is a panic reaction of those who are juggling and won't answer the calls, push them off. It's a real issue of an issa deraisa of leich v'shoiv. The lav of oishek. Leich v'shoiv. Now, on the other hand, there is also an issue of leisia leikenoisha, a lav in the Torah. One can't hound those that owe us money. There are laws of that that apply to the relationship between a creditor and so on. But the avoidance and sometimes the I shouldn't say the dishonesty, but the lack of forthrightness that can creep into to such situations is very, very unfortunate, and really borders on very serious isurim. Another responsibility that debtor has is what's called the Bal Chayv Mukdam and a Bal Chayv Mu'achar, which means that despite the fact that that a certain person that we owe may be hounding us more, but there are dinim also that apply to who is the person whose debt became due earlier, b'negeh to paying a Bal Chayv Mukdam. It's another very important halacha. Then again, we touched on the rights of someone who is owed money as a vendor or as a commissioner, which the other party is not paying. We discussed the concept of le'sia le'kanaysheh and some of the gedarim that may apply to that. The one thing which I think is important to put into this discussion is that the importance of using either a third-party rov or possibly a bezdin in a non-litigious way, but in an arbitrated and collaborative way to try and to resolve these issues. There is nothing wrong with either involving a rov or involving a bezdin. I remember once speaking to the Pesach Rosh Shiva Meir Stern Shlita, and about a certain issue that had come up, and I shared with him that one of the parties, they don't want to go to Bezdin. And the Meir Stern said, "Isn't Bezdin the way that Yidden solve issues? Isn't that the way the Torah intended it?" We somehow consider that going to Bezdin by definition becomes combative and acrimonious. It doesn't need to be. It's the way the Rebbeinu Shalom v'nigash el Elohim. That's the way the Rebbeinu Shalom intended it. Bringing halacha into the process is something which should be an everyday occurrence in the way that we conduct business. Baruch Hashem, especially in Lakewood, we're blessed by a number of outstanding rabbanim and dayanim who are both extremely informed in terms of the business landscape and in terms of halacha, and they can really be helped. They can really help, and we should seek guidance in terms of resolving. I've lost count, unfortunately, of how many dinei Torah have taken place of companies who've hit on hard times, and out of desperation, began to engage in very, very, very dubious practices in order to either deny claims or obfuscate claims and so on. And it would have been so much better if, in time, before it spiraled out of control, and the company started juggling too many balls, to sit down with someone who could give halachic guidance of both sides in terms of to resolve the issue, and would have prevented things becoming so much more difficult as time went on. And somehow we're resistant to it, and out of the resistance to it, eventually, unfortunately, what so often happens is it lands up in court, which, as we know, going to Erka'ois, even if we do have a heter, is really a last resort and fundamentally involves Chilul Hashem, and is really something which is something to be pursued only if really all other avenues have failed, and really if this could be put into the process earlier, so much of the pain and hurt and mistrust and broken business relationships can really be saved. And it's something really that is kedai to be mechazik.
I think with this we're going to conclude. I just want to once again thank the Rav for his timeless words and his crystal clear.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.